Mundane Lighting, how to take compelling bird photos in low light. Once you've been into photography for a while, we can take great photos in good light, but once the conditions start getting darker, we have cloud cover. I used to really ask myself, what kind of a photographer am I in this light? And that's a really compelling question to ask, because those conditions are where some of the best moments happen, and you really want to be able to get the shot regardless of conditions. So that's the focus of my presentation, and I'm going to be showcasing some of my work taken in Overcast and low light, and I'm going to be covering a little bit on the technical side as well. A little bit about me. I'm Shravan Sundaram, and you can call me Shrav if you want. My interest in birding and photography started at about 7 years of age. I grew up in an apartment complex where we had nesting Cooper's hawks, and they would fly around, make a big racket, hunt mourning doves, rats, and such. And it was actually pretty fascinating because once the youngsters would feed, they'd drop some of their prey items on parked cars and such. And it was just very amusing to watch. So I got very fascinated seeing that year after year after year. So I picked up my first camera in approximately 2008. I wasn't very serious about taking good pictures back then. I did start taking pictures seriously with the DSLR in about 2014. As Steve mentioned, I think I met Steve around 2016, so I was pretty new back then. So it's been about 8 years, I'd say now, since I started seriously taking photos. Some of my favorite subjects include diurnal raptors, such as hawks, eagles, falcons, and such, owls. I also recently have gotten into mammals, such as bobcats, foxes, etc. So in terms of my professional background, I graduated out of UC Davis with a Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife, Fish, and Conservation Biology and a minor in education in 2020. And currently I'm working as an environmental analyst in the public sector. So that work generally involves, regulations and interpretation of laws surrounding species and habitat protection. For today's agenda, I'm going to start off. Yeah.
I hate to interrupt, but you need to explain that picture on the previous slide, because it's pretty amazing.
Oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, so this is actually a photo of myself taken by a good friend with a bobcat in the background. So you can see me struggling to get up over there, but it's still a pretty cool picture. Really summarizes wildlife photography, the pandemic, and my aging body in one image. So fun image, and I love this image. It just really tells a story, and I just had to throw it in there. So thanks for asking about the story, Steve. So in terms of the agenda, I'm going to start off with the different main categories of low light bird photography that I encounter. This by no means is an exhaustive list, but I think it covers some of the major situations that most of us photographers will face with low light. I'm going to touch on equipment on low light photography and some of the technical aspects of low light photography in the field, how to take these images. And then finally, what I like to say is the other 50% of photography that is a little boring, and I hope I won't lose too many people on this, and I'll try not to dive into it too much, is the post-processing for low light photography. So 50% is taking the image, but when you're photographing in demanding conditions such as low light, the other 50% is processing those images in software such as Adobe, Lightroom, Photoshop, and such. So that is an aspect of photography that in 2022 we can't really neglect if you want to take compelling low light photos, in my opinion. And then at the end, as Steve mentioned, I want to give enough time for Q&A session. The first category of low light photography that I encounter is crepuscular and nocturnal birds. Nocturnal birds being birds that are active primarily during night, crepuscular being birds that are active, during dusk and dawn. Some birds include owls, nighthawks, etc. And oftentimes when you see a lot of pictures of owls during the daytime, you'll see them asleep, or they look a little stressed with their concealment posture, which is when they kind of flatten out. And to me, those images aren't very appealing. They don't really show the animal in their element. It looks a little unnatural. and it doesn't capture the essence of wildlife photography. I think that photographing nocturnal animals personally should be done in their element, which is in their hours of activity. I think this gives us a lot more opportunities to capture them hunting and with their eyes wide open. And additionally, there's the added benefit. You're much less likely to disturb such wildlife when you're photographing them when they're naturally active, and you can get a lot more intimate looks because they're going to be performing their natural behaviors. They're a lot more comfortable, and they may not even pay much attention to you. So for each of these three major categories, I've included a couple images along with some info about the image, such as the species and the settings. So this was an image that was very dear to me of a pair of Western screech owls taken a couple years ago. I've included the camera and lens info. So I took this image with a Nikon D810 body and a 200-500 lens. And this was a 4-second exposure. Now that seems like a crazy long exposure, but in this case, the goal of this photo was for me to capture as much detail as possible. So I wanted to make sure my ISO, which is the sensitivity to light, was as low as possible to limit the grain. So that's why I took a 4-second exposure. And additionally, why I wanted to extend the exposure was I narrowed down my aperture to f10. And the reason I did this was it was very dark, and my camera at the time didn't have a rear LCD that could focus very well. So I had acquired focus, pre-focused, but I wasn't sure how if the focus had shifted, or if, the birds had shifted over that time. So I just included I narrowed my aperture just to make sure I'd get critical focus on the subject. And since I had two subjects, they're pretty much on the same plane here. So I could have probably gotten away with a wider aperture, which means you have a less depth of field. But it's better safe than sorry when you want to capture multiple subjects to use a narrower depth of field. So you use a larger depth of field, which is a larger number, so you can get more in focus. And what's really interesting about these situations is when you're taking exposures above a half second or so, the act of actually pressing the shutter will introduce camera shake. So I use a tripod with a remote release. So I plug in the remote release to the camera and I actually click the remote to take these images. That way you're eliminating the potential shake that's induced by the actual physical act of pressing the shutter. That's pretty cool. You can also use a timer alternatively, but my issue with timers is you don't really control when you take the shot and the birds could shift and such. So these remotes are pretty affordable. You can get some for 10 to 15 bucks off Amazon, and they've worked great for me over the years. So that's the first image I wanted to talk about. And the next image is of a barn owl in flight. And this is with my current setup, the Canon EOS R5 and the 100-400 II. This is a little bit different of a situation because I was working with low light, but it was a subject that was in motion. So you can see here, I used a very high ISO and I used a very fast shutter speed relatively. This was taken about 20 minutes after sunset. So 1/400th of a second is a really fast shutter speed. And I also kept my aperture as wide as possible to let in as much light. And in this case, this is not how the image looked when it came out of camera. It was a lot darker, but my goal was to just capture the barn owl sharp. And I'll explain about how I recovered this image a little bit in the post-processing section. But, when you're seeing moments like barn owls floating over the field, sometimes my philosophy is to use the fastest shutter speed possible to capture this image. And I'm really glad I did in this situation because I only got one pass that evening that was this close as the barn owl kind of, began his or her hunt from a willow stand. So you really want to make sure that you're getting the shot. Sometimes it may not look great outside on the back of the camera, but you can work that later. If you have a blurry image that, is properly exposed, it's a little less useful than an image that's sharp, that's a little dark and such, that you can work with our amazing software nowadays. So this was a really great experience for me because I've never photographed barn owls in flight, and this was the first time I did it, and it was last winter. Moving on to the third image in this section. This was a trio of juvenile burrowing owls. This was out by UC Davis a couple of years before I graduated. So it was really fascinating in this situation because burrowing owls are pretty diurnal. So that means they're active often, I wouldn't say mostly, often in the day. But the chicks actually never came out until dusk for this particular burrow. And I think a lot of people didn't know that. So what I do is I just park on a pullout on the opposite side of the road, and I'd rest my camera and lens on my window on a little beanie, and I'd just wait. And these three chicks came out, and the reason they looked so alarmed, unfortunately, they were pretty close to a busy road. So whenever a big truck or something zoomed by, they would kind of get a little startled. So I was able to capture this, this picture, because I was able to find out that the chicks were active more in the later hours of the day. So I was able to capture this. And I took this with the Nikon D810 200-500 lens. And I was at a pretty slow shutter speed, 1/60 at ISO 1600, so medium. And once again, I was at f9, and the reason being the owls were not on the same focal plane. So I wanted to make sure I got all three of them sharp. So I stopped down and used the car window as support. And I think just when you're in the field, sometimes finding things for support is really important in bird photography. We're generally using heavy lenses, sometimes even getting down on a knee, using our knee for support, or if we're in a vehicle, using the vehicle for support. It can really make a difference in how many keeper shots we get. The second category I want to talk about is diurnal birds in overcast conditions. This is an interesting category because it isn't something that jumps out. With owls, it's logical to photograph them in the evening and in the night. That's when they're active. That's when you're going to get compelling images. But with a lot of diurnal birds, they're active in the middle of the day, during harsh lighting conditions. Sometimes I think overcast conditions can be the best because it extends your window to observe them and photograph them. And it also really helps you expose for the darker regions of the bird and the brighter regions of the bird. For example, on the left, this is one of the beloved Milpitas bald eagles. And this image was taken, I believe, around 10:30 or 11 in the morning in last February. So you can see that if it was a clear day, it would have been really hard to get good shadows on the darker regions. You would have this very dark, and you would have this part very bright. And even if you expose for it well and you handle it in post-processing, it's just really hard to get a nice image at that time of day. But because it was overcast, I was able to capture an image that showed details on both the light parts of the bird and the dark parts of the bird. And I think the point about extending the window is pretty important as well. When you're out photographing birds, you want to maximize your chances of capturing the moment, and overcast lighting gives you even lighting, and you're able to stay for a longer period of time. So that increases your chances of capturing the shot. Now, on the right, you can see a red-breasted sapsucker. And I think certain colors such as bright whites, as I mentioned, reds, yellows, and iridescents actually look better in overcast light. The details seem to stand out. You get light hitting from more angles, which gives a richer colors. And I just think you get a much more even exposure that showcases the beauty of the bird. I'm going to move on to the slideshow, which shows some more images. This image is of a male Allen's hummingbird. They're really little characters. They sit on these branches right around their breeding season. They migrate, I believe, to our Northern California areas around February. Males come first, females come second, and the males will usually stake out a perch. And they have to be pretty aggressive because the Anna's hummingbirds, which we have, are here year round. So these have to, stake their claim during their summer breeding season, and then they head down south, I believe, to Mexico, to their wintering grounds. So this was a particularly feisty male. He was actually chasing all the other hummingbirds so much you could see him physically heaving, like the exertion. And what I really liked about this image is the gorget, which is the throat patch, is really well illuminated. And this image was taken in natural light, completely no flash or anything used, but you can really see how it's just lit up and shining in red and gold. And I think the reason for this is in overcast conditions, you have light, being dissipated by the clouds, the water particles in the air, and you have light hitting from multiple angles. So instead of light just hitting it directly, which would make it, usually black. Sometimes when you see photos of hummingbirds under direct light, the gorget is sometimes black. And that's not to say that you can't take great images of hummingbirds in direct light. You can, it's just you'll have, more limited windows when the light actually hits them right. But in this case, this hummingbird's gorget was pretty much always lit up like this because of the overcast lighting just coming in from multiple angles. So that was, a good lesson for me because I knew I liked photographing in overcast light, but I didn't know the effects would be so easy to observe and so beautiful on a subject with iridescence such as the hummingbird. I took this with the Nikon D850 camera body with a 200 to 500 mm lens, and I used a 1/328 seconds, so a medium shutter speed, medium ISO of 1250. I did stop down to f8 because I was waiting really still close to the perch, and sometimes when you're closer to a subject, you have to be mindful of your focal plane. If I had shot this, say at f5.6, I may have lost a bit of the tail, a little bit more of the beak, and I had a good background, so I made the decision to stop down to a larger depth of field so I could make sure I got as much of the bird in focus. This is one of my favorite images. It's of a golden eagle prior to capturing a California ground squirrel. And I've photographed golden eagles since 2013. I would spend many hours waiting at pullouts by some of our back roads, trying to wait for them to do their hunting rounds and catch these squirrels. And what's interesting is this was a great ecological exercise for me. To learn how to photograph the subject, I had to learn about the prey. And California ground squirrels are very diurnal animals. They're generally active, especially in the winter, which is when I see golden eagles more often. They're very active once the ground warms up around 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. That's great to know, but the big problem is around 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. is also when you have the worst light. You have light beating down from the top. You get really horrible shadows. You get heat haze. Once the ground heats up and the air is cool, you get those shimmers, which just make it really difficult to get a sharp, compelling image. What I learned was the golden eagles would still be active on overcast days, as would the squirrels. So on overcast days, that 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. window was actually perfect because it softened that directly beating down light and allowed me to capture images which showed more color and details on the eagle, which is a very dark subject. And it also helps with the angles, because sometimes when the golden eagles hunt, you don't know exactly which angle they'll come from. They have their preferred routes, but they could come clockwise one time, counterclockwise the other. You just don't know. So when you have overcast lighting, you don't have the sun really behind you or in front of you. You have it softened from all angles. You can swing around and shoot pretty much, I call it 360-degree shooting, which is nice. It really gives you flexibility. And in a situation like I described with the bald eagle, you want to extend your window to capture that image in flight with the nesting material. Similarly, with the golden eagle hunting, you want to be out there as long as you can and photograph from as many angles as you can to capture the image with the prey. And fortunately, not without a lot of failure, I was able to do this after about, I think, 7 or 8 years of trying to photograph this species. So I was very glad about that. This was taken with a Nikon D850 camera with a 200-500 lens. I used a fairly fast shutter speed. Could have gone a little higher, but the golden eagle is such a dark subject that noise shows up very easily. So keeping that ISO lower so you have less grain in the image is helpful. And I'm glad this image turned out. Another situation here is of a relatively common subject, the red-tailed hawk, but a very uncommon moment. This particular juvenile bird I observed in urban Palo Alto last summer. And interestingly, this bird would feed heavily on earthworms. I didn't really know this was a trait that the species. I know smaller raptors such as kestrels feed on insects, but I didn't know red-tailed hawks do so. But it makes sense to me considering a relative of theirs, the Swainson's hawk, feeds heavily on insects too. But after doing some more research, I found out that juvenile red-tails often supplement their diet with insects in their first year, and that helps them survive as they improve their mammal hunting skills. So that was an interesting learning experience. And similarly here, I think it's another case of extending that window. Early in the morning, you have really good lighting, but the problem is, in order to capture this hawk with the worm, I had to use a fast shutter speed above 1/1000th of a second, and I just didn't have that light early in the morning. And this was actually a very interesting situation where we had the very unfortunate fires, but what the fires did was they created this sooty layer in the atmosphere. And what that did was it extended my window of shooting. And it also gave this kind of interesting orange glow to the image. So I was able to photograph this hawk at around 8:30 or 9 a.m. in the summer, which, as you know, as everyone knows, I'm sure, our California summers, the sun rises really fast. By around, I'd say 7:30 to 8, the sun's pretty high. It's getting hot. Lighting's getting bad. You get heat haze. So that sooty layer, in a weird way, helped by reducing the heat shimmer, extending my window, and allowed me to use a faster shutter speed. As you can see here, I use 1/1250th of a second, which isn't, I sometimes go even faster than that, but the lighting wasn't that bright because of the sooty layer, so I didn't want to go overboard there. But it did allow me to use a shutter speed that was just enough to capture the details on the worm and freeze the moment. And to the right, it's a standard portrait of the same hawk. And not too much to talk about this image. This was at a much slower shutter speed. I took it at 1/160th of a second. And I just wanted to illustrate how sometimes this lower light, it really brings out the glossiness in the eye. And I really like that. The catch light, as it's called sometimes, in the eye. I think it adds a lot of character and life to an image. And sometimes when you have direct light on a subject, the brow of the subject will cast a shadow onto the eye. And you'll sometimes lose a bit of an emotional connection to the subject. So sometimes these lower light moments really allow you to capture very intimate portraits of the wildlife. For the third category, this is deep forest. I want to preface this, I don't do this very often, deep forest photography, but I know it's a pretty big deal, especially in the tropics. And I have dealt with scenarios like this, sometimes when photographing pileated woodpeckers, black-backed woodpeckers in Yosemite and such. And it's especially common, as I said, in tropics and the coniferous forest habitats. And some of these species by nature, they live in these dark habitats. So we have to deal with dark conditions and patchy lighting if we want to photograph these subjects. So it's really important to have an understanding of that. This was an image that I took thanks to a good friend, Vivek Tiwari. I believe he's a part of Bay Area bird photographers, and I think he might have been given a presentation in the past, but this is a Pacific wren and it was taken in very dark conditions. And I used a Canon 70 Mark II and a 400mm f5.6 lens many years ago for this. And I like this image a lot because it's not something I did often, but I did really learn that I would have to be comfortable shooting at slower shutter speeds, higher ISOs. So dealing with the grain, having to be steady with my hand, and just, you take what you get in the situation and you look at it on the computer, work the image, sort through them, pick the best frames. And I think it's really important to photograph or at least be able to photograph in all conditions, because you just never know when you might see a rare species or a species that you really want to photograph when you're, abroad or traveling somewhere. So this was close to home, but a good reminder of that. For the bonus category, I also wanted to talk about some other wildlife. I'm not going to go too much into this, but recently I've been more interested in mammals, and I also like photographing reptiles when time permits. And some of the best times to photograph mammals, at least, is in lower light conditions. And these two bobcat images really illustrate the benefits of being able to photograph right around that 15-20 minutes after sunset window. As I mentioned for the red-tailed hawk, you can see just how dilated and large the eyes are. And I think when you're photographing something like a bobcat, the key factor of connecting to the viewer or the audience is the eyes. And I really like being able to showcase that catch light, that shine in the eye, and capture them with their eyes fully dilated. As I mentioned about the owl, bobcats tend to be crepuscular oftentimes, and I find them very active at that 1 hour period before and after dusk. And capturing them in that moment really gives you much more appreciation for their beauty, and viewers can really connect with the animal more. Whereas when I photograph them right around midday, you'll sometimes see them, they're kind of, their eyes are a little shadowed, they're a little sluggish, a little asleep. So just being able to photograph subjects when they're active and understanding their ecology and their behavior is important to me, and photographing in low light really allows me to do so. On the left, this is a California whip snake. I just stumbled upon this incidentally, and what I really like is this was in deep forest, and I really like how the dark tones of the body and the yellow were both properly exposed. If this was in direct sunlight, I would have probably been able to get an image, but it would have been a lot harder to expose the brighter parts of the body with the darker parts. So once again, you can see that balancing effect of being in the shade really helped make this image more compelling. This is another image of a gray fox. I really enjoy photographing gray fox. They're a fascinating species. They're actually pretty arboreal, which is unusual among canids. And this was another image that was taken during the smoggy smoke times. And I think this was taken around, I want to say around 4:30 or 5 p.m. in the summer. So in the summer, we still have a lot of light around this time, and it's actually kind of harsh. So if this was full sun, I would have had a lot of patchy light filtering through, and you would have parts of the fox bright, parts of it dark. But that sooty layer, once again, really dampened that and made it more uniform, which I really like. I don't like a lot of patchiness in my photos. I like this uniform lighting, and it just really brings out the eye as well. On the right side, this is one of my favorite bobcat images I've taken. And once again, in that 15-minute after sunset window, you can really see how the eyes are just lit up. You can see the sun setting, and you can see how they're shining. You can see the details in the iris. And I really like capturing that with bobcats. Their eyes are their main attribute. And I think photographing in that window really helps you showcase that. Now I'm going to move on to the equipment side. This is a bit more technical, and I don't want to spend too much time on this since I want to focus this on the ecology and the images and the techniques, but I just recommend sticking with a big three manufacturer for, better use selection, resale value, and customer service. So Canon, Nikon, Sony are all very capable right now. They'll leapfrog each other, but I just avoid, some of the lesser known manufacturers because you'll have less lens selection. If you want to sell your gear, switch it. It's going to be harder to find buyers. So I've listed some camera bodies here. I won't read them out because it looks kind of like Greek to me if I hadn't been doing this for so long, but these are some bodies that I'd recommend. And with photography, I'm just going to say this up front. It's an expensive hobby for wildlife photography. I think out of all genres of photography, especially bird photography, we're dealing with the greatest subject to camera distance. That means we have, a lot of space between ourselves and our subject. We need to crop. We need to be mindful of situations such as heat, haze, and lighting, which we usually don't control. And we also put the greatest strain on our autofocus systems and on our sensors because we're photographing in unpredictable natural settings usually. So generally speaking, it is going to run a lot of money to have equipment that is capable in low light, but at the same time, there's a lot of capable bodies and cameras from the past few years that don't break the bank and have very good low light capabilities. So I'd stick with a big 3 full frame camera with a decent resolution so you can crop in, but you could also use some crop sensor bodies as well. From the big 3, they have a few more affordable options. And you know that for clarification, a crop sensor camera basically is just a camera with a smaller sensor. So you're effectively cropping in camera, so you're getting closer to the subject. And typically there's some slight sacrifice of low light capabilities, but recent advances have made that minimal comparatively, so that's always an option. Moving on to lenses, it's a balance of aperture, which I discussed in a lot of the images earlier. The smaller the number, the wider the lens, the more expensive it is, the larger the front element, which is the front part of the lenses. There's f4 and f2.8 lenses, which are great. They allow you to let in a lot of light, but there's 2 sacrifices that come with those lenses. One is obviously price, and the other one is how easily you can handle these lenses. I used to believe that, you know, the widest aperture lens was good, and I used a 500 f4, which was fantastic, but that lens weighed 8.5 pounds, and it was a struggle for me to hike and hold that lens. And what I realized is, you know, an f4 lens that I can handhold at 1/100th or 1/200th of a second wasn't that much better than an f5.6 lens that I could handhold, say, at, you know, 1/30th of a second. So I'm slowing my shutter speed over 2 times and still getting a sharp shot. And, you know, that really helps, especially when you're trying to get angles, you're in awkward positions, just being able to do that helps. So it's a balance in between, you know, being able to use a wider aperture lens and being able to handle it, or using a narrower aperture lens, letting in less light, but being able to, you know, shoot at slower shutter speeds, being able to get in better angles, saving some money and such. Another item I wanted to address is image stabilization. I think that's critical. Basically, image stabilization is when the lens has technology in it which stabilizes the viewfinder and stabilizes the image. For wildlife and bird photography, we're using such long lenses. There's going to be camera shake no matter how steady we are, even on a tripod. So having a lens with this is critical. So I would always check whatever lens you're buying, make sure it has IS, VR, or OS, whatever, you know, different manufacturers call it different things, but that's important. The last topic is native lenses. Generally speaking, if you have a Canon camera or a Nikon camera or a Sony camera, I'd recommend sticking with the same manufacturer for the lens. That just allows you to have better autofocus performance. Use a teleconverter, which is, you know, just like a magnifier between the camera and the lens. There are some other options such as Sigma and Tamron, which are more affordable, and they have improved recently, but typically you can't use them with teleconverters very well. So keep that in mind. So talking about techniques now, just in terms of camera setup, I personally believe for photographing in low light, you want to photograph RAW, just because RAW files include all the images. JPEG files that we take in our phones or, you know, point and shoot cameras, which we can also take in our professional cameras, apply inbuilt sharpening and noise reduction, which is irreversible. So if you're photographing in very low light, you'll have a smoothing effect sometimes applied, over sharpening applied, and, you know, it just doesn't give you as much flexibility to work with these images. And as I mentioned with these barn owl images, these were very dark initially, and they were very grainy based on the conditions. So being able to take that raw image, run it through the software with the settings I wanted, really helped me, you know, obtain usable images from that experience, which is really important. Another thing I'd recommend is disabling all camera noise reduction settings, sharpening settings, and lens correction. So even when shooting RAW, there's these settings. So I just disable everything because computer software is so much more customizable and fine-tunable than what goes on in the camera. I would just do all of that in the computer. Another item I like implementing is back button focus. Typically when we're using cameras, you know how their default setting is when we half press the shutter, it focuses. But sometimes I just don't like that because I don't want to feel like I don't want to accidentally take an image. And I just feel like when I'm half pressing the shutter and sometimes full pressing it, I lose separation and control of what I'm doing. So a lot of the cameras have an AF on button on the back. So when you go to your menu, you can disable the shutter focus method and you can actually focus using back button. And what that allows you to do is you can focus without taking an image, which I think is powerful. You know, sometimes it's good to focus on a bird as it's flying in or as it's doing something, and just take shots when you want. I think that's a really powerful tool, and I'd always recommend using that. It helps you make sure that you're capturing photos at the moment you want it the most. And it just simplifies the situation because when you're using the front shutter, there's a single shot focus and a continuous focus mode. And typically, continuous focus means that whenever you have that shutter half pressed, your camera is going to continuously try to focus. Whereas single shot means when you have it pressed, it'll focus once and stop. And what's nice is typically for wildlife photography, we always want to have our cameras in continuous autofocus just because wildlife's always moving. But sometimes you want to have the ability to use single shot. And what back button allows you to do is when you want to continuously focus, you just keep that button pressed. When you want to focus and then stop, you just press that button and let go. And you don't have to change any other settings. You can just set your camera to continuous focus and do that. And I think that just with photography, we're out in the field, we're in difficult conditions, we're looking for birds. Sometimes we don't remember to change these settings. And I myself have missed some great moments switching accidentally to single shot and forgetting to switch back. And, you know, I just want to make sure that doesn't happen again. And I always say, you know, it's okay to make mistakes in photography. Everyone does. I make them all the time. I'm going to make plenty more this year, next year. But what's really frustrating is when we make mistakes and we repeat them. And I just try to avoid repeating them. And I think technology gives us a lot of ways to avoid repeating mistakes. So that's why I recommend using back button focus. Oops. So in terms of lens settings, I think using stabilization, as I said, that's the image stabilization, vibration reduction, or optical stabilization, whatever it's called. I think it's important to use it at all times when hand holding or even panning on a tripod. It varies from brand to brand, but mode 1 is an all axis stabilization. So that means that you get stabilization up and down and side to side when you shake. So whenever I'm shooting static subjects or, you know, subjects that are not in flight, I'll use that because I'm not panning, I'm just shooting with my camera still. But when I'm photographing birds in flight, for example, they're moving in the horizontal plane, say they're moving from right to left in my frame, I don't want the camera fighting me. So I want it stabilized up and down, but not left to right because I want to be able to pan with the subject. So I'm currently shooting Canon. I used to shoot Nikon. So in Canon, mode 2 is only vertical axis. And I believe in Nikon, sport mode is only the vertical axis. So I typically switch to that when I shoot flight. Additionally, for images such as this screech owl and the other image I showed of the 2 screech owls, I turn off stabilization for long exposures about a half a second and longer because for some reason, even with the best stabilization technology in the newer lenses, it gets a little confused on the tripod when we're taking such long exposures. And sometimes it overcompensates and creates a jarring effect in your shots. So I just turn that off and use the remote release and make sure you have a really stable tripod. I can't understate how important that is. I've used tripods that aren't the most stable and I just could never figure it out. But a friend recently told me, really make sure your tripod's grounded, and tripods often have a center column that you can raise. And I used to raise that, to make sure my camera was as high as possible. That way, I was getting high level shots. But I realized that sometimes when you're raising that center column, it's much more sensitive to vibration. So I would be very I would be disappointed because I'd look at my shots after the fact and find out that they were blurry. So just be mindful about how stable your tripod is and turn off stabilization generally for long exposures. And another item is mechanics. I know mechanics of photography, which is, how we hold our hands and how we, how our lens tripod foot is or how we're holding our lens. What I really like doing is I like reversing my lens tripod foot when I'm hand holding. That allows me to use it as a handle for the camera, and it allows me to get a more get more surface area on the bottom, because a lot of those lens foots are very narrow, so it's a little awkward to rest your palm on them under the camera. But when I flip it up, I can just rest my palm on the grip or further down. And when you're shooting at very slow shutter speeds handheld, that actually is critical. Little wobbles can mean the difference between a sharp and a soft or blurry shot. So that's something to keep in mind. Just tucking your elbow, making sure you're, if you can stabilize, against your knee or on a vehicle, just being mindful of that. And sometimes it's hard to do so. I get excited when I see something, I forget to do that. And then after the fact, I said, if I had remembered to be a little more stable, hold my camera with better technique, I may have gotten a few more shots. And, it's never going to be perfect. Sometimes we just have to react and take images and live with how many shots we miss and how much we get. But the more we keep these things in mind over and over again, it builds into our muscle memory and we set our foundation better for the future. Moving on into shooting settings, I think, as I've mentioned throughout this presentation, it's a bit of a balancing act between ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, which I'll discuss a little later. Typically in low light, if we're shooting action, I'd say the most critical item is shutter speed. So I'd say the critical path for shots such as this is shutter speed, because the barn owl is moving to the frame. I can't worry as much about grain, because if I do, I'll risk getting a blurry image. So I have to take the image at whatever shutter speed is required. And I think the lowest I could get away with, I found, was about 1/400th. So I dealt with that, whatever ISO I got it at. I said I'll deal with it in post-processing. Now on the image to the left, this is a different scenario. This is a juvenile western screech owl with a dusky-footed wood rat prey, one of the coolest images I've taken, just because the wood rat was actually bigger than the owl and he was struggling to carry it, and it was just amusing to watch. But in this case, the owl was very still. So in this case, I'm not really trying to freeze action. So I'd say for this image, the critical path would be the ISO. I want to make sure I'm capturing as much detail, so I want to use a lower ISO and I can sacrifice some shutter speed. So one thing I did note is, provided you are stable. I was on a tripod with a remote release here, so I was able to lower my ISO. If you were in handheld in this situation, you would probably have to be a balance between these two. You'd have to sacrifice the ISO a little bit just to make sure you get a sharp image. So keeping that in mind. With regards to aperture, typically for low light, my suggestion is to be as wide open as possible. So that's a smaller number, letting in the more light. But depth of field is sometimes a concern. And as I mentioned, for that 2 western screech owl image and for the burrowing owl triplets, using the narrower apertures, the higher numbers, which just allow you more depth of field to capture more subjects in focus. A larger focal plane is important. So that's something, I guess, practice takes time to be mindful of. There's many times I've photographed subjects, from up close or multiple subjects, and I've tried to use too wide of an aperture because I'm worried about, ISO and, I want to use a fast shutter speed. But just being mindful of when you're shooting multiple subjects or are very close to your subject, even in low light, is important. Now, sometimes something's got to give. In low light, sometimes, you just have to shoot with the widest aperture, because if you use a narrow aperture, you're going to not be able to get a sharp shot at all. And similarly with the other situations, in this image, the ISO just had to give. So there's going to be times when you can't get a perfect image. No image is perfect. But these are decisions that I try to think about sometimes even before I go out to the field. I think that's key as well. Just thinking about these things before you go out to photograph. Because once you're in that moment, you're observing, these majestic birds and creatures engaging in their natural behaviors, it can be tough to think about these things because reaction times become a factor and just excitement becomes a factor. So just as we, think about these things, preset our cameras, it becomes more of our natural muscle memory and process, allowing for better images. Now, this is where it gets very technical, is the post-processing side of photography. I could honestly do another presentation on this, but I want to keep this simple yet informative. So the workflow I use is I use Fast Draw Viewer to sort my files. Basically, when I transfer my images from my memory card to the computer, I want a quick viewer that I can use to identify sharp images, and I'll move those into my computer to process. There's other viewers that I'm sure people could use, but I just suggest not using something like Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop. Those are more of processing, editing softwares, and can be a little time consuming and difficult to quickly go through files. So my opinion is to use something like a simple raw viewer. And recently there's a software called DxO Pure Raw that has come out, and it actually renders our raw files into a DNG file. And I don't know what a DNG file stands for, but you can process it just like a raw file. And with a lot of higher megapixel cameras, a problem I've noticed is when I open the files in Adobe, the Canon R5, my current camera, the files look very noisy and the starting point's very noisy. And that's a problem for me in low light because I want the best starting point possible. So this software, DxO Pure Raw, applies its fancy artificial intelligence software algorithms, and it's able to produce a DNG file, which basically functions as a raw file with much less starting grain. And I think it does a really good job preserving the details. There's a lot of YouTube tutorials on how to use this, but I use it in a deep prime setting and I disable all the sharpening and such, which I do later on in my workflow. And it seems to work very well for me. So I'd recommend that to anyone interested in shooting in low light. And then, as I mentioned, I love Adobe Lightroom. I believe there is Adobe Camera Raw, which is similar in Photoshop. And I just process the DNG file in Adobe Lightroom, adjust my shadows, highlights and such, colors and stuff. And, there's a software called Topaz Denoise, which was very famous a couple years ago. I really love that software, but a problem that it has is if you have a very noisy file, it tends to over apply sharpening. And even if you reduce the settings, it seems to still apply it too strongly, and you can start to see some fringing and stuff that I just don't like in my images. But what's great is when I use it in conjunction with DxO Pure Raw, DxO Pure Raw already helps the image, so Topaz has a lot less work to do, and I think it works great. I use this for images that are at very high ISOs or dark conditions, like that Barnell flight. I ran it through both. And I still disable the sharpening, and I try not to use the Topaz at a very high strength. I typically use around 5 or less. And then I adjust minor contrast and background adjustments in this plugin called Nix FX Pro 4. It's a great plugin. I think it adjusts contrast really well. It's a little easier for me to work with than Photoshop, so I like that. And then one thing I do with Photoshop is I just sharpen my images as needed using the Smart Sharpen tool. So this is just my workflow. It's a little complicated when you look at it, but it's just how I do things. There's many other options such as DxO Photo Labs, Capture One. There's just a lot of software coming out. And regardless of what software or approach you choose to use, when processing low light images, I'd recommend minimally cropping and minimally adjusting. Whenever you crop an image in, you really amplify the grain and you lose pixels, which is what cropping is by definition. When you're cropping in, you're reducing the resolution of your image. So I'd suggest just, when you take images in low light, being mindful that, if you crop in a lot and if you're expecting to adjust that image a lot, you may not have a satisfactory end result just because there's a lot of strain on the sensor or the camera to capture a good image. So generally trying to get your image as close to perfect as you can in the field is critical for low light imagery. And I think just keeping in mind that to keep your processing to a minimal in these situations will yield the best results. Thanks so much for listening.